of Gestational Surrogates by Chris Ann Caffrey, Tori Lindlow, Michaela Smalls, and Ashley Watson. Our learning goals and objectives are to evaluate the autonomy of the surrogate. Secondly, to look at the effects of surrogacy and the role of money on potentially manipulating more vulnerable women. Thirdly, to determine if genetic makeup is a satisfactory criteria for using a surrogate. And finally, to determine if the emotional effects on the child, on the surrogate, and on the parents using the surrogate are satisfactory to make surrogacy unethical.
There are two types of surrogacy: traditional surrogacy and gestational surrogacy. This case uses gestational surrogacy, and the difference between the two is within traditional surrogacy, the surrogate uses her eggs and also gives birth to the child, whereas in gestational surrogacy, the embryo, the sperm and egg, comes from the intended mother and father. And within gestational surrogacy, there's an agreement for the gestational surrogate to host the child, the eggs, and then the sperm and egg normally come from the intended mother and father. This process goes all the way back to the first surrogate in 1980, and after she gave birth to the child, she was emotionally attached, and now she's an advocate against surrogacy. It also goes back to the Bible when Abraham and his infertile wife Sarah conceived through traditional surrogacy. And this process is very long and drawn out, and it contains many expenses between the surrogate and the intended mother and father.
There are two types of surrogacy. One type involves a surrogate mother who uses her own egg and carries the baby for someone else, traditional surrogacy. And our case, as Michaela said, is gestational surrogacy, in which the mother has no genetic tie to the child she carries. A woman, after a bout with uterine cancer, has had a hysterectomy, surgical removal of the uterus. Before its removal, however, she had several eggs removed for possible fertilization in the future. Now married, the woman wishes to have a child with her husband. Obviously, she cannot bear the child herself, so the couple utilizes a company to find a surrogate mother for them. The husband's sperm is used to fertilize one of the wife's eggs and is implanted in the surrogate mother. The couple pays all of the women's pregnancy-related expenses and an extra $18,000 as compensation for her surrogacy. After all expenses are taken into account, the couple pays the woman approximately $31,000 and the agency approximately $5,000. Though the surrogate passed stringent mental testing to ensure she was competent to carry another couple's child, after carrying the pregnancy to term, the surrogate says that she has become too attached to her child to give it up to the couple. A legal battle ensues.
Potential impact in the professional sphere is that the surrogates and genetic parents are recommended to have different physicians so that each physician can advocate for their patient 100%. There's a problem with dual loyalty, in which the physician is shared between the surrogate and the genetic parents, which can cause problems because sometimes they have opposite views. The physician must make sure that the embryo is free of virus so that any harmful cells won't be transferred between the surrogate and the fetus. The physician must also advocate for their patient to fully have informed consent, in which the patient is fully aware of what they're signing up for 9 months. The scientific impact: fetus and surrogate could have a transfer of stem cells, which can be harmful and beneficial depending on what cells are transferred. So it's important for genetic screening prior to the fertilization of the egg, so that there's genetic screening of the biological father, mother, and then the surrogate, to make sure that no harmful cells are passed between the surrogate and the fetus. And then the surrogate may have difficulty delivering, which could lead to the loss of the fetus, which starts out as a scientific impact and could follow as legal and ethical, because depending on what happens with the fetus legally. And then legal, a lot of these are unsolved. Who gets to keep the baby if it is defected? So a lot of times genetic parents want the perfect child, and they don't always get that. So who's responsible for the baby if the biological parents don't want it? And then, as Ashley stated in the case, the surrogate's healthcare is paid for by the biological parents because they're paying for the surrogate to house their child for 9 months. And then who decides how the baby is birthed? For patient autonomy, the surrogate has 100% autonomy until the baby is delivered, but a lot of the times genetic parents want to say in how their baby will be delivered. In the ethical sphere, the surrogate has autonomy over the fetus, but that's not always the case because they have economic and societal pressures from genetic parents as well as the physicians. In Israeli law, the surrogate has 100% autonomy, but the surrogate shares the physician with the biological parents, which can cause problems because the physician will be advocating for both the surrogate as well as the biological parents who don't always see eye to eye. And then there's a mental effect on the surrogate. A lot of the times it's hard for them once they've birthed their baby and then they lose the baby to these genetic parents. So it's been found in scientific studies that the fetus and the surrogate leave imprints on each other, and there's an attachment between the two.
Another key aspect to this case is that it is commercial and not altruistic, meaning that the surrogate is being paid and she is not just giving up her body and only having her medical expenses being paid for. So since it is commercial, a lot of people argue that this is baby selling, and it is compared often to selling of organs, which is baby selling is a universal crime. So the issue with this, if you look at the money being paid as being paid for a woman's work throughout the 9 months for just carrying the child, then it can be considered more ethical. However, if the money is being paid just for the delivery of a healthy child, then the baby selling argument carries a lot more weight. There have been previous studies done that investigated commercial surrogates, and they found that they were mostly working class and lower education levels. Most of the women said that they were doing it just because it was fulfilling to them. However, when asked, only one said that she would still want to be a surrogate if there was no financial incentive. So this showed that money played a very large role in surrogacy and could affect the autonomy of the woman, of the surrogate. Also, the mental health of the biological parents and of the child. In our case, since it is going to court, if this is drawn out, it could significantly affect the child and how they're growing up, and it can also really affect the parents who are genetically related to the child, who this entire process have believed that the child become theirs easily, no problem.
So, surrogacy allows women who would not normally be able to carry their own child to create their own biological children using science. In certain cultures, infertility is viewed as undesirable because the woman is not fulfilling her duty by continuing her husband's lineage by producing offspring. Surrogacy makes it possible for this couple to pass on their genes and their family name. Surrogacy relies on IVF treatments, so medical technology has improved, which helps other women who were seeking out traditional IVF treatments as well. Because another woman is able to carry a child that has no genetic relation to her, some wealthy women are taking advantage of this opportunity to have their own biological children without the stress of pregnancy. In this case, we looked at the 4 principles. In beneficence, which is when the physician is trying to benefit the patient, each physician is trying to advocate for their own patient to keep the child because it will help the woman's mental health. However, we need to consider the beneficence of the child. Many adopted children want to know who their biological parents are, so in this case, giving the child to the biological parents would reduce later stress and loss of identity. Also, the child should go to the family that is more stable, and usually this is directly correlated to financial. And since the family is paying for a surrogate, they most likely are more financially stable than the family of the surrogate. So non-maleficence is when the physician tries to do no harm to the patient, and in this case, each woman would suffer mentally if she does not receive the child. So each physician is going to be advocating for their patient to receive the baby. Autonomy is the patient's right to make decisions about her own body, and in this case, the surrogate has the right to make a decision about what happens to her. Justice is the allocation of resources, and in this case, the surrogate is getting paid to deliver a product, and she is expected to carry out and fulfill her contract. So she should be able to give the baby to the biological parents as promised.
So in conclusion, we determined that the gestational surrogate should not be able to keep the baby. We said it's not hers genetically, and she's also been paid to carry the child for the biological parents. Looking at the 4 principles, we see that the biological parents are most likely better off financially, and they also have a genetic connection, and we believe this outweighs the emotional trauma on the surrogate, because there would also be emotional trauma on the side of the parents. So in this case, we recommend that the biological parents are able to keep the child. But we also recommend that the surrogate go to see a psychiatrist, because the emotional weight of this decision is not lost on us, and we know that this will be a significant transition since she has formed a bond with this child, even though it is not genetically related to her.